Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Over the years, Ron Franscell's books have earned high praise from best-selling authors such as Anne Rule and Vincent Bugliosi. He is the best-selling author of The Darkest Night, and his writing has been often compared to Truman Capote. Ron grew up in Wyoming. A lifelong journalist, he worked for newspapers in Wyoming, New Mexico, and California's Bay Area before hitting the road in one of American journalism's best beats, covering the evolution of the American West as a senior writer for the Denver Post. Shortly after 9/11, he was dispatched by the Post to cover the Middle East during the first few months of the Afghan War. In 2004, became the managing editor for the Beaumont TX Enterprise, where he covered the devastation of Hurricane Rita. After Ron's divorce, he feared he was the link in a long chain of estranged fathers. But when the author and his teenage son embark on a road trip to the Yukon to seek out a macabre cocktail containing an amputated human toe, they unwittingly begin a journey into their own past, present, and future. The SOURTOE Cocktail Club is a true-life love story about fathers and sons set against epic backdrops and overlooked places. It is also a road book that attempts to answer for one father and son a pivotal life question: where does the road go? Our book that we're featuring this evening is The SOURTOE Cocktail Club, with my special guest, journalist and author, Ron Franscell. Thank you for agreeing to this program, and welcome back to True Murder, Ron Franscell.
Oh, Dan, thank you for having me back. I'm just delighted that I didn't screw up so bad the last time that you wouldn't have me at all.
You got to get a little bit more confidence in yourself, Ron. So.
I have a great time doing your show, but tonight, despite the build-up, we're not going to be talking about killers or mass murder or anything like that. Although I have to admit, I don't know exactly where this toe came from. But we're not going to. Well, maybe we'll talk about killers before it's all over. But this book, is a little brighter than my usual fare.
Yeah, and the thing is, though, I think that it's very interesting for people who already are aware of your work, love your work, to now to get a chance, which is a rare opportunity, to hear about something that's life-changing in your life. And we will ask some questions about, obviously, the book answers it to a certain degree, but we're going to ask some questions for the audience because, of course, they're just hearing about this program. But we want to know, we're going to learn quite a bit about your son, and we're going to learn quite a bit about yourself and your history. And so being a prolific writer, a true crime writer that has written a couple things that are that have affected a lot of people, I think our audience will be very interested in how you came to all of this and how this has informed your personality and this great book that we have here now. Again, like I say, a life-changing experience for those that don't know otherwise, a true crime writer. So let's get to the SOURTOE Cocktail Club.
Yeah, let's do.
Now, first, I think we should talk about your job at the Denver Post. You say you drove more than 8,000 miles per week writing about the West, 80,000 miles in your first year on Route 66.
Yeah.
Tell us first tell us about your marriage, and then tell us about your job at Denver Post, and where are you at that point in your marriage when you have this job at Denver Post. Take us back.
Well, let me take you back a little bit farther than that. My then wife and I were the co-publishers of a small daily newspaper in Wyoming where we had both grown up. Now, we had worked for newspapers elsewhere, but come back to Wyoming to raise our children in a small town and to run a newspaper. Things just ended up going badly, and not for the newspaper. The newspaper was doing terrifically, but the relationship sort of very slowly sagged under its own weight. And we ultimately divorced when my son was 13 and my daughter was 17. Being a small town and being the publisher of the newspaper up to that point, it wasn't possible for me to just go get another job there in town. You know, there was no other newspaper, there was no other media outlet that I could just casually show up and start a new job. In the American West, the next biggest place for me to go, or the next best place for me to look for a job, was Denver, Colorado. And as it happened, they had been dreaming for some time about some new kind of reportage that, for them anyway, where the typical ordinary journalism was told with a little bit more narrative flair. And because at that point I had written some novels, as well as had long experience as a journalist, they thought I was perfect for that. And so they assigned me to the job as a senior writer and a columnist to write about the evolution of the American West. And my job was to wade out into this vast region and find stories where the past, the present, and the future all intersected, where by looking backward, we might see where we are and where we're going. And it was a beautiful job for me. I got to blend, real journalism, real stories, truth, with all those tools that I developed as a novelist, to bring drama to a story, to bring to give it a pace, to give it a meaning, and I just loved that. And it was doing that caused then my bosses to send me to the Middle East right after 9/11 in hopes that we could begin to answer some of the questions that we were all asking ourselves in North America at that time, for an American audience, and they saw no better way than to send someone who could tell that story on the short runway that I had become accustomed to working. So that's where I was, and in that process, I didn't travel 8,000 miles a week, but my first year on the road was 80,000 miles. What was happening was I was using the road as therapy. It was my sanctuary. I would spend 5 or 6 weeks generally out reporting, driving all over the American West, looking for these stories and writing them, and living that road life. It kept my mind off of all the pain that had just gripped me in the backwash of this divorce. And during that time, I was able also then to spend a lot of time with my son where he lived in Wyoming, because I was on the road and I could visit fairly often, but it wasn't every day. And it was in the first summer of after that divorce that he came to me in my little house in the Colorado Rockies, and we spent that glorious summer together, and we tried to do too much. We wanted to fit every missed day into the days we had.
Right.
So it was during that time that I ran across a mention, I think on the internet one night, about this bar in Dawson City in the Yukon. And what I learned was that you could go there and you could order a drink, and they would show you to a little room in the back, and there you would be sworn to an oath, and having taken the oath, a funny little guy would drop into your drink a mummified human toe.
Incredible.
And when I told my son this, now he's 13 years old, he was immediately intrigued by the idea. Now, I think because he was 13, anything that involved liquor and anything that involved disembodied body parts was fascinating to him. And so it became a kind of code to us. It after that, for many years, we would talk about the toe as this thing that we shared, this kind of fantasy that we shared. And we had always sworn, to ourselves that we would do it someday. When he became a college student, 18 years old, he was driving to college, and I was checking in with him throughout the day because it was a long trip and it was his first time doing that sort of thing. And toward the end of that day, I noticed he was getting tired, and so we just spent a lot of time on the phone talking, not really talking about much of anything, just keeping him talking. And he mentioned that during that day he had thought about the toe.
Oh.
And it was at that moment that I decided we were going to do this. And so it's the road, lies literally under this story, obviously, nearly 5,000-mile journey to the Yukon and to the Arctic beyond. But it lies in the sort of metaphoric sense under this story, too.
Now, for our audience, I think this is a very, very important part of the story is your own childhood and your own relationship with your father, biological father, and your stepfather. Tell us about that. Take us back to your life and tell us about that.
When my mother was pregnant with me, her first child, a young woman, married less than 2 years before, my biological father left and never came back and never turned around. It was many years. I was a young boy before she told me that my biological father had abandoned us, and that the man that I knew as my father, and who continues today to be my father, was not, my biological father. And that's kind of confusing when you're 8 or 9 years old. And it was confusing to me. Nevertheless, I grew up with my stepfather. I continue, now to have a wonderful relationship with my stepfather. But for many years, I didn't know anything more than what my mother had told me, which wasn't much, about my biological father. I found him when I was 30 years old. I was a journalist, and I used a lot of the skills that I'd learned as a researcher and as a journalist to find him. And he, at that time, was living in Panama. So it was another couple of years before we actually met, and it was a very strange meeting, as you might imagine. I told him in our very first face-to-face meeting that I wasn't looking for a father. I had curiosity about where I came from, as you might imagine, but that I had a wonderful father, and I didn't need a father, and that the best he could hope for was that we might be friends. Mm-hmm. In time, I learned his story, and I learned that he, too, had been abandoned in his life by his own father. And as fate would have it, I learned even later that my grandfather had also been abandoned by his father. So we're looking at essentially 4 generations of what I call accidental bastards, people who ended up not having a close relationship with their biological fathers. And here I was, newly divorced, and contemplating that I had just, in my way, abandoned my own son. Suddenly it became very important to me to try to rectify that. I couldn't go back. I couldn't change time. But I began to think about how I might disrupt this rhythm, what I could do that might cause my son not to be in the same position my father, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather had been in. So that all plays into this very, very interesting, very poignant, very funny at some points story into the wilderness of Canada.
Now, you asked him some profound questions as well. What I found very, again, this is you've bared yourself to the bone here, and left nothing. You've left nothing out. But you talk about posing the question to this Tom Lane, your biological father, about whether he's actually loved. If he's actually, explain what exactly you ask him and what he asks of you, and why you ask that question.
The wording, I'd have to look at the book to get the exact wording, but I was trying to get at his capacity for love.
Right.
Because, of course, I had never felt loved by him. But having gone through that divorce, as I did, I began to wonder about my own capacity for love. Mm-hmm. When you don't have a model for that, when you can't look around at your own experience and find a model for what love looks like, you don't know if you're doing it right.
Yeah.
You might think at times that this is, that you've gotten it and that it feels like love. But when it comes right down to it, you don't really know, do you? I mean, if you don't know what it looks like, how can you know? How can you know if you're doing it right? And so that's what was kind of going through my mind. That I questioned his. Yeah, obviously, I questioned his capacity for love, but I wondered if I had inherited that in some way. And so I was really kind of exploring. I was really kind of exploring the nature of love and the love, the kind of love we talk about between fathers and sons. And do I answer that? I don't know. I think people take away from this kind of a story what they will. It's very difficult sometimes to predict or even to expect that your message is what they will get. But in that particular exchange that we talk about, we go into that, and in a way that is kind of poignant, I think.
Yeah, you also asked the question because you did quote. You said, "Do you wonder if you're capable of truly loving someone?" And then later in the conversation or that day, you asked, "Do you ever feel that something is broken inside you?" And what did he say to that question?
I think refresh my memory. What? My father is a vagabond, and I don't even call him my father. I do for radio, I guess, but he's not my father per se, and I refer to him in the book by a different name. Right. But he's evasive that way. He's, as I say in the book, he's the hero of his own stories, and all of his own stories, and so any answer he gives you, you kind of have to hold it up against that, and that becomes the test. So he talks about what passes for love. And he talks. That's kind of an illusory kind of term to me. That he thinks he's been in love, or at least what passes for love. And I begin to use that same sort of phraseology as I go through this book, and it pops up here and there in unexpected places. What passes for love, or what passes for drunk, or what passes for adventure. And he gave me some of the really, I think, interesting parts of this story.
Yeah, before we get to more of the actual trip itself and more of the planning, what I found very interesting as well, and it must have had a profound effect on you in a negative way, was that your parents didn't show. It seemed to be that your mother was disappointed that you didn't have a different career and that you had picked journalism, and that when you got married, they didn't even show up attend the wedding, which was a month after you graduated journalism school. And it seemed that you didn't find out, and you explain in this book, find out 2 years later that you didn't realize that that's what it was. It seemed to be a disappointment in your choice of career and profession, and you don't sum up how important that was or how profound that was an effect on you. But what did that do to you when your choice of profession, instead of the parents being real proud, they seemed to not be in contact for a while? Please explain that.
Right. Well, my parents were, children of the Second World War, really, and they were both born right at the tail end of the Depression. To them, college, they couldn't get college. First of all, they didn't understand college. They couldn't see how this was a value. To them, it was, you're paying somebody to tell you how to go get a job, when you could just go get a job.
I see.
And so it didn't make sense to them. And we were, I would say lower middle class family, they didn't have the wherewithal to send me to college. So it became the easiest thing in the world for them to say, well, you're not going to go to college unless you can pay for it yourself. Ultimately, I did. I did do that exactly, and I am, to this day, the only one in my family of 5 kids and their kids, except for my own children, who went to college. Now, both of my children have gone to college too, but that's a reality that a lot of people live with. My mother, in particular, saw me as too dreamy. When I remember her asking me one time, what is it you want to do with your life? And she sort of put it in that kind of cant. What is it you want to do with your life? And when I said, I'd like to become a reporter. Someday I'd like to run my own newspaper. She was dismissive of that because not because she thought I was an idiot, but because she thought I was kidding myself.
Right. And
that I wasn't being realistic, and that I was only setting myself up for disappointment, probably a lot like the disappointments that she had felt in her own young life. And she knew the pain of that. So I think that that's where it comes from, and I have no greater supporter now that I'm an accomplished journalist, that I'm
right.
a best-selling author, and that I'm telling stories like this one. I have no greater fan than my mother, but in those early days, I think her hyper sense of reality and my dreamy qualities, my fantasies about becoming a writer, really bothered her, and it did work on me. But it probably made me all the more interested in succeeding as a writer and a journalist.
Now, before we go a little bit further, I want to know, in the context of this story here, you were in Afghanistan in 2001, and let me see, in 2004, you were managing editor for the Beaumont Enterprise. When did you write The Darkest Night? And tell us what your personal connection is to the people in The Darkest Night, the book The Darkest Night.
I had been working for the Denver Post, and it was after I came back from the Middle East that I began to feel very strongly about telling that story, partly because for me and for my community in 1973, this was like a little 9/11. On September 24th, 1973, we all went to bed and everything was fine. This was a wonderful world, and we lived in an idyllic existence. We wake up on the 25th and everything has changed. That suddenly doors are locked and night falls and you're in the house and porch lights are on and there's a fear that has absorbed the community. So in some senses it was on a very, very microcosmic scale a kind of 9/11 for me and for other kids who knew these two girls who were abducted and terrorized through the night and then monstrously thrown off of a very high bridge. They lived next door to us. They were neighborhood kids, and in a neighborhood where there were many kids and where we saw each other more as brothers and sisters of different mothers than just neighbors. We played together. We experimented in forts and digging and army men together. It was that kind of a relationship with everybody in the neighborhood. Again, brothers and sisters, and it was no different for these two girls. So the effect on the kids of our neighborhood and in the larger town was profound. And I wanted not only to explore this crime, but I wanted to explore how nearly at that time, 30 years later, this remained a fresh wound, that the memory was still vivid and absorbing. So it was not. I didn't set out to write a true crime. I wanted to tell a true story about how one moment of unrestrained barbarity could poison a whole community's memory and could cast this dark, dark shadow across generations. So it was a true story. It was about a crime, but to me, it was bigger than true crime.
Right.
And so what came of that was, of course, The Darkest Night, and it was embraced as that kind of a story. Now, you even mentioned that it has been compared to In Cold Blood. I think the reason it is that it happened. It's a monstrous crime that happens in a small town, much like Capote explains in the book, with the Clutter family being massacred in Holcomb, Kansas. And it was an attempt at doing it in a literary way, which is what Capote did, and which is different than the typical true crime that you see on today's supermarket shelves, which tends to be more reportage, more leaning more toward the lurid and the grotesque and a lot of blood and that sort of thing. I wanted this to be something bigger, something that went deeper, and it was much more complex. So that's the book that came out of that.
Now, obviously, your life was changed. You became a best-selling author by virtue of this book, especially. And then they referred to you as a true crime writer, which you say, geez, I'm not really a true crime writer. So, but I wanted to know, what was the response? I know your son, Matt, must have been young, but when did he actually read that book, or did he read the book, and if he did or didn't, why, or what was his response if he did?
I don't recall. The Darkest Night, of course, came out around 2000. The first edition of it came out in 2007. So by that time, he was in college, and I don't know. I certainly, he's aware of it and he knows the story, but we never have had a specific sort of literary deconstruction about the book. We've talked about that with many other books, but not that particular one.
I see.
He very early, I remember him picking up my very first novel. He was a young boy. He was 11 or 12, I think. And, well, actually, when my first novel came out, he was, I guess, 12 or 13. And I remember him reading that. And now I was a little uncomfortable with that because it wasn't written for a 12 or 13-year-old. But
right.
It was difficult for me to say, you can't read your father's novel,
Yeah.
And I remember him, we've talked about that, but The Darkest Night, not so much with him.
Interesting.
But he's a voracious reader, and as we do in SOURTOE, we're often stuck in these sort of literary conversations.
Yes. Where
I think you get to see very starkly two different minds at work.
Yeah, and I think he really does covet his own reading and would like to keep it, well, it seems like he's trying to keep it his own thoughts and interpretations about the books that he's reading and he's passionate about, maybe to himself, because it seems like he thought you were dragging it out of him or making fun of him when you did discuss the Fight Club and Chuck Palahniuk. And anyway, now tell us, just before we start the journey with Matt, and when you first spoke about this, the idea was hatched in your mind, or at least the germ of the idea was when he was 13. He's now finally 19 when you actually decide to embark on this trip to the Yukon. What is Matt like? Tell us about the character of Matt, your son, and over that 6-year period, you said you had a fair amount of time because you were on the road, that you would go and watch his baseball games and be involved in his life, even though you had to travel into your former town that you lived in. But tell us what was the relationship like? How strong was the relationship during that 6-year period? And at that age, when you're just about to embark on this trip, what is your relationship like?
It's a big question mark to me, to be honest. If it might have been as good as any father has with his son,
right. But
I still had this question mark because I wasn't around him every single day. We spent a lot of time together, but it wasn't every single day. And because I knew that he was angry about the divorce and about how he was kind of left abandoned, I think in his mind abandoned, because not long after the divorce, my daughter went off to college. So all of a sudden he's home all the time with his mother, and she's living the life of a single mother, and he's got a lot of anger about that, and I definitely saw some changes in his personality. I think this sunny, bright, always laughing, always joking little kid became a little darker and a little more cynical, and to me, he would have been justified and probably did hold some against me as well as his mother for putting him in this position.
Right.
And I think any parent, that's a horrible feeling to have, that you're being blamed for your child's pain. And so I wanted to do anything I could to not make him feel that way. I wanted to do everything I could to have the reassurance that I was relevant and that I was loved. But most of all, I wanted to make sure that he knew he was loved. And all of that kind of goes into the concept behind this. But as I say in the book, once I decided that we were going to take this trip, the first thing I did was go to Panama to see my own biological father,
right,
and to begin to sort through some of the issues that might shed light on my relationship with my son, and insofar as I could, to maybe begin to nudge the future a little bit more in a direction that I could live with.
There is one more character I'd like to talk about because it seems to be quite important to the story as well. And if I mispronounce this, you can correct me. Guala Seze, and the son
Jula Seiji.
There we go.
Jula Seiji, yeah, who it was during this sort of dark period after my divorce, and I was on the road, and one evening, really, it was the end of a very, very hot day in the Arizona desert, and I drove off into the desert because I wanted to see what was a beautiful, beautiful, brilliant sunset, but I wanted to see it as far from humanity as I could possibly get. And I drove out into the desert in my four-wheel drive pickup and went off-roading a little bit. And while I was out there, came across a small monument. There was a chair, there was a little table. Somebody had put rocks around some of the greasewood shrub, the scrub that was out there in the desert, and a sort of stone fireplace. And somebody had obviously lived in this area, but there was a sign that was posted there, and it basically described that the man who had lived there had just died about a month before, and he had no one, and I thought, who lives out in the desert, and under these circumstances, and who puts rocks around, these scrub plants in the desert like it's a home? And I became fascinated with this, and I wanted to know more. And when I investigated a little bit further, I found out that Jula Seiji had been a Czechoslovakian immigrant, and had himself had died of a heart attack out there in the desert. He was a prospector and a desert rat, and he had no money, so he was buried in a pauper's grave in Quartzsite, Arizona. During my research, I found that simultaneously that there was a son that he had abandoned decades before, who was looking for him. And suddenly I felt that I was the only person in the world, and I think it's true. I was the only person in the world who knew that Julius Agee was dead and that his son was looking for him.
Oh.
And it became a kind of obsession of mine to let this son know that his father that he was seeking had died. But none of the old message board posts by the son had good email addresses anymore. Right. So the son was lost too now. And I began to put all those research skills to work, and but unfortunately came up empty. And the one thing I did do, though, was leave a message with the county coroner in Quartzsite, Arizona, and said, if this man ever contacts you, please tell him that I was trying to find him. It's maybe a year later when I get a call from the son, and he had found his father's, he had found out what happened to his father, and this coroner had told him that I had been trying to find him. So he called me and we talked, and I suddenly felt better that here was another son who had been seeking a father, and I didn't want that father to go unfound. What the son's reaction is in the book.
Yeah, it's sort of anticlimactic for sure.
It's surprising.
Yes, it is. But you did, it was interesting how hard you tried to do this, how much of a mission it was, and you accomplished what you set out to do. So I think it gave you some much-needed confidence at that time, I would think.
I think so. I think it made me feel, I knew as well as anybody can know what it felt like to want to know what happened to your father. Right. And I couldn't casually let that go. Maybe I should have, but I couldn't. And because it happened in that period after my divorce, I was especially attuned to family relationships. Sure. And fathers who had disappeared. And it was, it all becomes part of this story.
Now, you embark on this trip to the Yukon, and you have to go pick up your son Matt in Wyoming, 1,500 miles away. So it takes you a little while to get there. What did you really, I know that you wanted to make sure that you had a bond with your son, and you wanted to make sure you understood what that bond was. I'm oversimplifying this, but what did you specifically feel and believe that you would actually get or garner from going on an actual road trip? What did you actually think would be gotten from going on a road trip with your son? What would he get out of it, and what would you get out of it?
At that point, it was hope. It wasn't belief. I mean, I was hoping that this would turn out, that this wouldn't collapse under its own weight. Right. That it wouldn't be a bad idea. It was really an effort to bridge a gap by creating memories. I wanted to show my son in a very concrete way that I loved him more than I could ever explain to him. And I wanted, before I came to the end of my own life, I wanted to be able to give him the most precious thing I've got, and that's my own time. Because it was the thing that I missed the most in that period when, after my divorce, between the divorce and this trip, it was the one thing that was missing. And so that's what I was hoping was going to come from that. And I would say in that 1,500 miles between my home in Texas and his home in Wyoming, where we would finally really start the journey together, I had a lot of trepidation about it. I had a lot of fear that this was not going to be what I had hoped.
Did you have some, from your own experience reading classic books about road trips and the profound effect that a couple people could have on this road trip, on this journey, did you have sort of a fanciful sort of visions of that there would be some profound effect by virtue of the experience for Matt of being on the road and experiencing all these incredible sights and sounds and the experience itself? Did you, in your mind, in your literary imaginary mind, did you envision that for Matt?
I think I hoped for that. I mean, I already knew the character that he had, and that it would be a tough sell to make this romantic, because he's not a romantic. He's sort of a very pragmatic, very independent, and still in many ways at the time angry. And so any vision I had that this was going to be something romantic and a fantasy come true, I didn't really entertain that. It would have been unwise. But I did hope that along the way that whether it was just an alignment of stars or something that I would say, or something that would be said to him, or maybe something that he just saw fleeting past as we were driving, would stick, and that it would make sense to him, and that maybe in some way he'd say, "Hey, Dad, I get it now, and it's okay." Now that never happened, really. Not at least in so many words, but nevertheless, that was my hope. And then the further we plunged into Canada, and the longer we were on the road, and the more we talked, and the more I began to see this thing unfolding out in front of me, there became another goal, and that was to and I didn't know what we were going to do, but it was this idea of that we talked about earlier, the disrupting that awful rhythm of Accidental Bastards. And I really became obsessed with the idea of what can I do that might break that rhythm, that might break that cycle while I have him. What can I say? What can I do? What can happen that we maximize the chances that someday he won't leave his own son or daughter, and that we will have stomped that terrible cycle out. And so those two things began to boil around together for me. Meanwhile, he's watching Scrubs reruns on his portable DVD and listening to heavy metal and flirting with the girls, or at least having the girls flirt with him, and giving me these occasional glimpses into him that were surprising and challenging. And again, and of course, that's all described there. But I would say it would be safe to say, I think, that what I had hoped for and what I had expected probably didn't happen. But what did happen was even more surprising. And so I think that it's a good example of, being focused on one thing while something else wonderful is happening.
Sure. That's a great way of putting it. Now, you're talking about your son Matt. He's got his Megadeth and his Pantera T-shirt on, and he's got his long hair, and he's listening, like you say, he's watching Scrubs reruns, and he's 19 years old. And so you're in Canada and within a few days, I believe, or shortly, and you go through Calgary, Alberta. So you're going through part of the Rockies. that you're familiar with, but not immediately, obviously.
No, yeah.
But so tell us what some of the checkpoints and some just a couple of the snippets of those profound little moments where along the way, as you're heading towards the Yukon, you do have these moments. I know the one moment I thought was quite humorous is that in the, as you mentioned, the Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance,
Yes.
there is a moment where they see a red-winged blackbird, and along the way, lo and behold, there's a red-winged blackbird, and
right.
much to your dismay, Matt could care less probably, or does not get, and so you explain it. Please tell us a little bit about that interaction there, and then tell us about one where you were surprised, where you did something profound did happen again to your surprise. That maybe was unexpected.
Yeah, of course, Robert Pirsig wrote the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance back in the maybe late 60s, early 70s, and it became one of the great road books. I mean, it's a very deep book. It goes into philosophy in these sort of complex terms, but it revolves around around him and his son making a run from, I think, the Dakotas across Montana to California on motorcycle. And the son is much younger, I think about 10 or 11 years old at the time of the trip. And Pirsig, who had, and it's a true story, Pirsig had a nervous breakdown in his life, and he was concerned that his insanity would be passed on to his child, and he didn't want his child to go through that insanity. So there's a kind of a parallel there. Well, we're traveling across Montana on, sort of the beginning leg of this trip, and we see in the middle of nowhere, here's a red-winged blackbird. A red-winged blackbird, much like Pirsig had contemplated on his own trip and talked about with his son, and it became one of the symbols of the story. So I mentioned it to my son. He never heard of the book, didn't much care if such a book existed, and suddenly his writer father becomes father again and wants to tell the story and for him to understand and to see the parallels, but he's kind of uninterested in that, and I think it's a nice little vignette of that every father feels at some point, where he's trying to get something important across to a teenager, and it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And then so in this book, it's it becomes one of those illuminating moments where you begin to see that these two characters that are together for the next 3+ weeks on the road are not always going to see things the same way.
Sure.
As far as later, I mean, I remember, I guess it was, we were well into Canada at the time, and we had been talking about mythology and religion, and again finding that we didn't always agree on things, but I was impressed with his thoughts. And while I didn't agree, I fell in love with listening to him tell me why he felt something.
Right.
And I remember in particular that one night he had a duffel bag and I was moving it or something, and when something fell out of it, and think I say in the book that I would have been less surprised if it had been a bag of marijuana.
Right.
Instead, it was a copy of a book by a writer named Brian Greene called The Elegant Universe, Superstrings, Hidden Dimensions, and the Quest for the Ultimate Theory.
Wow.
Huh?
Yeah.
I mean, I thought, what? I mean, it was talking about things like rips in the fabric of space, vibrating strings, quarks, things that I wasn't going to grasp. And yet my 19-year-old son appeared to be well into reading about. And so here I was, frustrated by my inability to get him to be interested in Perzig's red-winged blackbird and this personal exploration that he made, when I discover that my son is really pondering issues that are beyond his father. So again, it's a little illumination of the difference between these two characters. And I think that ultimately the book kind of explores how men, even, fathers and sons, can be both comrades and competitors in the wilderness. Now, maybe that's a physical wilderness, a geographic wilderness. Maybe it's an emotional wilderness. So you get, just because we're father and son, it doesn't mean necessarily that we're always comrades.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're competing, and I think those two moments show that.
Yeah, certainly. Now, the original idea was to go to this, what ends up being the Sourdough Saloon, where there is the SOURTOE cocktail. So please briefly explain what is the legend of or the story behind the SOURTOE cocktail.
Well, that was the bar owner, a guy named Dick Stevens, who owned the Sourdough Saloon at one point there in Dawson City, bought an old rum runner's cabin out in the sticks. And one of the rum runners who had owned it were two brothers. And one night during the Depression, they were running liquor into Alaska, and the Mounties got on their tail. They had to take some evasive maneuvers, and one of the brothers stepped in a sort of semi-frozen area, and on the journey, his toes became frostbitten. They get home. His brother chops off the frostbitten toe, puts it in a jar of whiskey or rum, and they put it, because it's winter, they put it under the floorboards of the cabin where it stays for decades. This Dick Stevens buys that cabin from the elderly surviving brother, and who tells him the story. And indeed, as he's refurbishing the cabin, he finds that toe in the jar. He takes it back to his bar, and it's just a conversation piece. Everybody's talking about it, they're joking around, and then somebody puts it in somebody's drink as a joke. And it dawns on him that this is a little bit like Robert Service's poem, The Iceworm Cocktail, where they put a piece of spaghetti in a tenderfoot's drink, and it makes him sick because he thinks it's an ice worm. And it became a thing, that you could test your mettle by raising a glass that had this mummified human toe in it and drinking the drink. Well, now they've made it into a tourist thing, although not every tourist who goes there is going to do it. So it has become famous, or at least in the right circles. If you travel in the perverse, grotesque circles that crime writers like I do, then you hear about it. But,
yeah.
So I don't really even recall how I found out about it originally. I can just, like I say, it became a shared fantasy that we had that we were going to do this, and indeed we did.
Now, how are you traveling to Dawson Creek, and how are you rented? Tell us what you rent, or how you actually go there, and what your accommodations are along the way.
Well, we drove in my Subaru to Calgary, and in Calgary we rented a camper van, which we then drove not just to Dawson City, but then beyond that up the Dempster Highway into the Arctic, where we intended again to do another poetic thing on the father's part, to camp out on the longest day of the year when the sun doesn't set. So we have this story that starts in this intense darkness after a divorce and ends on a day when there is no darkness. And it is just a beautiful poetic thing, but it's absolutely true. And that's what we did. We were in a camper van, which we did a little damage to, because the Dempster Highway is a bitch of a road.
And you were warned.
And we were warned many times, and we dismissed it. We thought, these pussies, they're what do they know? We're from Wyoming.
Yeah.
Well, we were wrong. They were right. Now I've said it.
Yeah. Canadians were right.
The Canadians, the Scottish people, the Germans, everybody along the way told us. In fact, I think even one Texan, everybody knew the reputation of the Dempster Highway. We knew it was a bad road, but we didn't think it could be as bad as they were saying. And again, we were wrong. It is as bad, but it's also as beautiful as it is bad.
Now, by the time you get to the Sourdough Saloon, you talk about the evening before, and you're eating some local food, some Arctic char, which I've had myself. Fantastic. Now you are going to go to the Sourdough Saloon to sample this sourdough cocktail, see what all the fuss is. And tell us about what happens when you go to the saloon itself and you refer to someone at the back of the room.
Refer to somebody at the... Oh, you're talking about the fellow that did the toe? What are you talking about?
Yeah, well, they say, well, you have to talk to that person, and he was in the back.
Oh, right, okay. Well, yeah, they call him the captain. And the tow captain is somebody whose main function is to administer the oath and then to drop the toe into the drink and then to ascertain that it touched your lips. In our case, we wanted to take pictures, and it's kind of hard to take a picture through a cocktail glass and see if this toe touched your lips. So in both my son and my case, we actually took the toe in our mouth between our lips so that you could see that it clearly touched our lips. And but the toe captain is sort of the MC, and he's the guy that keeps everything running and takes your money and issues your certificate that represents your membership in the Sourtoe Cocktail Club. And I'm proud to say my son and I are both members, which I think only means that we can always go back to the Sourdough Saloon and drink the Sourtoe cocktail without paying the extra $5 or something that it costs to have the toe put in your glass.
Well, there.
So,
see? Savings.
Yeah, it's a great money saver.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we're a little bit over the hour, but we'll just spend a few more minutes here. This whole trip was a little over 3 weeks, you said.
Yeah.
What is the most profound thing that you learned? I know we've talked about a little bit, but at the end of this entire thing, to wrap up in terms of the journey itself, you basically it was a success. But tell us what you learned the most. What was the most profound thing that you learned in that in this journey with your son?
I think that here I was, a vagabond, maybe much like my biological father, that I had relished in my life and in my career these risks of being a war correspondent or riding out a hurricane and doing some of the things that I did and would do again. Yet there were risks in my life that I refused to take that thousands of people take every day, and that is, just surrendering to love and recognizing when it comes along and risking the hurt that goes with it. Of course, At that point, I knew the hurt that went with it, and I was reluctant to take that risk again. So, I think that the biggest thing was this epiphany that I had about the nature of risk and how I was perfectly willing to do some of the most risky things that humans do, and then perfectly frightened of risking things that ordinary people do every day. So there was that. I think that, the book talks about, in its way, that reassures us that we don't need to repeat the sins of our fathers, and that we can navigate our own paths quite well, and that there are ways we're not hostage to our history. So I think those are the two things. Sometimes it just takes extraordinary courage to come out on the other side of a great sadness and to accept your flaws and to find love. And really, once you do that, putting a corpse toe in your mouth is pretty damn easy.
Incredible. One last question here. How has your son Matt responded to the idea of the book, and is he planning to read it or has read it? What is the plan with Matt regarding this book that certainly he is a huge part of?
Well, he of course knows everything about the book. There was a lot of collaboration during the writing on where I was asking questions and trying to get at some of his interior. But during the time it was in manuscript form, he didn't want to read it. Not because he was afraid of it or anything. It was just he wanted to read the book. Right. Well, the book just arrived literally last Thursday. So as far as he and I are concerned, it wasn't a book until last Thursday. Right. And he immediately got a copy. I think it was sent to him Friday. So honestly, I don't know yet. I think he's going to be okay with it. I haven't heard bad, but I don't think he's actually had a chance to read the book, or if he has, he hasn't had a chance to digest it and respond. I'm pretty sure, though, that he's still going to be mad because I don't get Pantera. He's going to be mad because I just don't get it.
Don't appreciate it, yes.
That's right, I just can't.
Well, there's still time, Ron. There's still time.
That's right. I've got plenty of time to get into heavy metal.
Yeah.
If it'll have me.
It'll have me, yeah. Maybe not, yeah. Oh, well, Ron, this was really a lot of fun again. Once again, you're a great interview, and I love speaking with you and letting you explain your incredible books. And this book, like you say, it's quite different from this program. Almost entirely we do something that has to do with murder, and there's no murder in this entire book. And no yet, I think the audience will very much enjoy this interview with you, Ron, and talking about your personal life. I think it's personal, poignant, humorous, and profound. And I think it was a very enjoyable read. And, of course, the follow-up, I get to enjoy having an interview with you. So thank you very much, Ron.
You're so nice, and you're just so generous having me on your program. I appreciate it.
Well, it's a lot of fun, and I'm sure the audience had a great time. So I want to thank you very much once again, and have yourself a great evening, Ron.
Thank you, Dan, very much.
Well, thank you, and talk to you soon, Ron. Thank you.
You bet.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them, with my special guest, Ron Franscell, with his new book, The SOURTOE Cocktail Club. That's Ron Franscell. Good night.